Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of Open Air presented by the Harvey B. Gantt Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm Dexter Wimberly, and I'm very excited to welcome today's guest. Qualeasha Wood is a textile artist whose work contemplates realities around Black female embodiment that do and might exist, inspired by a familial relationship to textiles, queer craft, Microsoft Paint, and internet avatars. Wood's tufted and tapestry pieces mesh traditional craft and contemporary technological materials. Thus, Qualeasha navigates both an internet environment saturated in Black femme figures and culture and a political and economic environment holding that embodiment at the margins. Like the vast majority of her age peers, Wood has operated one mortal and multiple digital avatars since pre-adolescence. For her, what are intuitive combinations of analog and cybernetic compositional processes make for a plainly contemporary exploration of Black American femme ontology. I'm pleased to welcome today's guest for Open Air, Qualeasha Wood.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. The thing I always like to say whenever I'm doing these things virtually is that we are sort of at the mercy of the technology. So hopefully, I'm coming in loud and clear. I can hear you perfectly. And of course, if you have any difficulty hearing me, just let me know. So I've just read a very brief synopsis of your bio, but I would love for you to take a moment to introduce yourself in your own way and kind of share a little bit about who you are and what inspires you and talk a little bit about the work that you make.
My name is Qualeasha Wood. I am a artist from Long Branch, New Jersey. I grew up in a really small town on the Jersey Shore. Notable other residents of Long Branch, Bruce Springsteen, and that's really kind of about it. It's just me and Bruce. And so I kind of grew up in a town that was really small, didn't really have a lot of art. And so when I talk about art, it's really exciting because I never really envisioned a world in which I would actually become an artist, or that art would actually play any role into my future. Both my parents are military veterans. My mom served in the Army and my dad served in the Navy. And I actually had plans to join the Air Force. So it was quite a big shock to everyone when I kind of deviated from that path and chose to go to art school instead. And I think, my purpose in making art has always kind of been to answer questions as to why. And when I think about my practice and its role and its function, I think it's just about kind of questions and answers, and examining daily life. So I look at the ontology of the Black femme in our past, present, and future, and try to make sense of existence. Especially for me, I find that conversation and those questions often come through a lens of queer theory and Afro-pessimism. To be specific, Frantz Fanon has a quote that always really challenged me, which was, "I came into the world imbued with the will to find a meaning in things, my spirit filled with the desire to attain the source of the world, and then I found that I was an object in the midst of other objects." And so really, I think about the Black femme kind of as an object, right? And then especially me as a queer person, I think about being Black and queer and kind of the paradoxical relationship and, how we function within a white supremacist society.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious to know what drew you to the medium that you use. So I see behind you there's these spools of thread or yarn, and I'm
Mhm.
imagining that's because that's makes its way into your work. But maybe you can talk a little bit about textiles and what drew you to that as a medium.
Yeah. Textiles has always been a part of my life. Even when I say I never expected to be an artist, I really didn't expect to be a textiles artist. I originally was really interested in illustration and kind of more graphic design. I think those qualities do show up in my practice now, but it definitely was not my original intention. But I think textiles has always returned into my life and made itself known. I grew up with an understanding of textiles, and I guess I'm really going to talk about craft, because that is really where that relationship starts with me. It's a relationship to craft, and a lot of the women in my family were crafters, and so whether that was knitting, crocheting, needlepoint, cross stitch, sewing, there was always something. And my parents as well often hung textiles in the home, like most people would hang prints or paintings. And so I would say that my earliest memories of my childhood, like my earliest memories on this earth, are through a textile lens, through seeing kind of these patterns, these colors, these flowing objects behaving in ways that weren't necessarily standard. So I think just naturally kind of gravitated towards the ability for textiles to kind of tell a story or express something. I always remember my mom saying, we would look at art and that could be something in the store, something on the street, but the language that she used was always the same. And I think it's really important. She would always say, "Look, Qualeasha, that's a pretty picture." And I think kind of having a pretty picture as like a baseline guide for what art is without kind of all the stuffy language that we get as we go into art spaces, I think was really freeing, right? When thinking about what art was. So I think already I kind of grew up with this in my brain, right? This value for textiles and craft and these handmade beautiful objects that held a sentimental value to me over traditional mediums like painting or drawing, despite then going to art school originally to pursue those things. And, I think the pursuit of that was, the way that, right, the conversation around craft and textiles is often had. Um, my great grandmother and my great aunt were both women who made a lot of objects for the family. So I also had a lot of, and I still do have, objects that they made. So quilts, stuffed animals, and all those things. So when I first got to college and the decision is now coming to what I want to do, I really ended up working in textiles at first through a desire to connect. Um, Again, like thinking about a lot of these mediums, these traditional mediums, and their rules. And, when we think about accessibility and we think about access in the art world, we do have to think about class, and we do have to think about, elitism. And I think it is hard to go to an art school that is, only 1% Black at the time, and kind of relate to your peers who have had, their entire lives spent in an art academy preparing to be some of the finest drawers in the world. So for me, I kind of was at a loss, and I really was not enjoying my time in the space. And so the first textile that I ever made by myself was a quilt. And it was really kind of to reference, that quilt that my grand had made for me years and years prior, kind of to have that familiar object, that thing to hold. And I ended up embroidering a self-portrait onto it, which my mom taught me how to embroider. So really, I wanted to bring in these skills that connected me to home, that weren't really being pushed or celebrated in that space, and bring it into the space. And so that was where I really started with textiles. When it came to developing my fine arts practice as it is today, I think I went back and forth a lot. So after deciding, okay, hey, illustration's not for me, which really came through a much longer journey. I'm like, it's amazing what you can go through in like 4 years. And that very first year of college, kind of having these like mini battles like with the self and with, adjusting to an institution. I was really blessed to meet Faith Ringgold my freshman year, and I told her how much of a struggle I was having, and I wanted to switch at the time into printmaking, and she really encouraged me to kind of follow my gut and to follow my heart and to really study something that I was passionate about, and at the time that was printmaking. And through going into printmaking and kind of learning that process, I ended up just naturally gravitating towards material and the feel of material more than I did the aesthetic. And so I always wanted, the paper that I touched to kind of be, the toothiest or like the softest paper, or just have some type of special quality. And then the colors really mattered to me. And then I realized one of the best parts about printmaking was that I didn't have to work traditionally, that I could work on fabric if I wanted to, or I could work on plastic. I could work on literally anything that I could fit within a press. And so that's when I started working on fabric again within my main practice. And then kind of then tried to go back to traditional printmaking as like, I was encouraged by my professors at the time, but it just kept coming back up for me. And by the point that I started working with the jacquard weavings, I had tried, I would say, almost every other thing on the planet, right? And I just knew for me that the work existed so well digitally. But at the time, NFTs, there wasn't a language for NFTs, really. They weren't popular. The concept didn't exist. And so, digital art wasn't popular, and, the concept for NFTs didn't exist. But I knew the work just had to have this place, this physical place, but printing it out on a piece of paper or doing, a 5 layers silk screen print, at 24 by 36 was not big enough. The scale wasn't serious enough. And lo and behold, like I said, textiles kind of came back around. I was visiting my grandmother one winter break, just randomly. I'm always kind of staying at my grandmother's or my aunt's house usually when I'm trying to visit my family. And it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and she's, giving me stuff to tuck myself into bed with on the couch. And the blanket she gave me was a jacquard woven, and it had photos of myself and my cousins and my brother. And that was the first time I learned that an image could be woven. And immediately, I'm freaking out. I'm like dissecting the entire thing. It's not an art piece, right? But it, for me, like was the spark to create. And so ended up like getting with a bunch of my friends, and they, helped me figure out the process. But it really just went from there.
Well, thank you. I mean, you've shared a lot, and I want to kind of come back to a few things you mentioned. So one thing you mentioned was craft,
Yeah.
and I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on the distinction between craft and fine art, and if you feel like that is a very sort of firm distinction, because I'm sure these are conversations you've had before with curators
Yeah.
or collectors. So that's the first thing I want to ask, and then I have some other follow-up. So let's start with that.
My first thought on that is that I don't think there should be as big of a distinction that there is. I think we can talk about them as separate things, but I think that oftentimes things are reduced to being craft and not given the respect of being fine art, versus it kind of being more of a conversation about like content, right? I think if the conversation was like, oh, well, something is more craft based because the content is not, for example, original, for lack of like a better like idea on the spot, like that would be one thing. But I often think that craft is reduced because it often is found in marginalized communities, and there are often marginalized people making these materials or working with, found materials, found sources, these like found mediums that are also viewed as domestic work often, or associated with women in domesticity. So I think there is a lot of negative connotations around the word craft. And I often think that we separate craft and fine art not only through then content, but through labor, and this like idea of, X amount of hours equals X amount of greatness in a work. So I think there are a lot of issues at play when it comes to making that distinction, and I don't really think there should be one as much as
Thank
possible.
you. Thank you. And then the other thought that you expressed, or idea you expressed rather, that I want to get into is this sort of technology and how technology plays a role in the work that you make. I think that most contemporary artists, living contemporary artists, will have some interaction with technology. Even painters, whether they're projecting images or using digital photos as a way of like referencing things. But for you and your work, just kind of generally speaking, like what what role does digital technology play in the work that you make?
Digital technology is at every part of my practice. I think, especially for me being a millennial Gen Z cusp baby, so I was born in 96, there wasn't a time that I was alive that, technology wasn't constantly evolving, and that it wasn't constantly at a certain point like a part of my everyday life. I went to school and someone handed me a computer. Everything I did, it was on the computer. In fact, for me, when thinking about Microsoft Paint, I think of that as one of my earliest drawing mediums. And I think of that as actually one of my most accessible drawing mediums, because drawing in Microsoft Paint was free. And, markers and paper and pens and all of that cost a lot of money sometimes, when you're thinking about having to replace those things. But I think, everything I do is about this relationship that we have with the digital, with technology, with the ability to now connect with everyone faster than we ever have before. Even right now, the technology to be able to speak on a call, when you think about it, is quite insane. And so there is nothing that we do without that. And I think that we are just now a people that are ultimately affected. And I think those effects, good or bad, we can, debate or study the why. But I just think it's it's inevitable. And then when I think about more specifically material, there is a long relationship between the jacquard system, the jacquard weaving system, and early computers. And Charles Babbage, who wrote the analytical engine, he kind of just like wrote this and drew up this kind of archetype for like early computation, which we used for binary code. It was, based off of the 0, 1, binary, which was also the on and off, X input, yes, no system for the punch card for looms. So for me, it kind of just always circles back to that moment. So when we think about digital technology now, I also think like we think about digital technology, but everything's technology at this point. Yeah. I'm like, I could ramble, but I will stop myself from kind of going into then, I believe in AI rights and all of those things. So,
I want to get into that in a bit, but I want to come back to some of the terminologies that you use, even in the brief, which for clarity is obviously an abbreviated version of your bio that I read when I introduced you. But even the term Black American Film Ontology, right? That isn't that those aren't four words that people use all the time in the every day, right? So maybe
no.
we could take a moment and even just talk a little bit about that. So, Black American Film Ontology, like, okay, like share a little bit more about like what that means for the audience here that may not necessarily know.
Yeah. When I just say Black femme, American femme ontology, I'm like, it is a mouthful. Sometimes I do hear my own bio and I'm just like, I would love to just write, I make art about life as a Black woman. If I could really just, be allowed to have one sentence or like as long as like an Instagram bio and not paragraphs. But, I am really aware, especially now, of how much my identity is tied, right, to being Black, to being a cis woman, to being American. And this study, the ontology, the study of existence, of function, of purpose, I think has always been really concerning, because it's about like the right to existence or the questioning of existence or like, is there anything there? And so in saying that, it's really just about these intersecting identities that really kind of leave us with nothing. And I also like am very specific with right saying Black because I want to talk about Blackness globally, but I also am like clarifying, well, I'm American, and I do show and work now, internationally. And I think, I just had a conversation with a curator yesterday, and it was a really great conversation. We talked for a really long time, and we were talking about something. They were like, "Oh, you're so American. Like the work is so American," and I think that's very accurate, and I think that's very true. And some people might be offended by that, but I also think that the way that we understand race and politics in the United States is very different than how race is understood in the UK, for example, and how it is experienced in the UK. And so there are a lot of different factors there. When I say femme, also, I am conscious of the fact that, conversations on gender are always changing and always expanding. I really am hesitant to use like words that are going to ostracize people that can relate to my practice, because at the end of the day, it is about my specific perspective, but it's also about a global experience. It's about relatability. It's about being able to connect and feel validated by the work for some people. And for other people, it's a call to kind of introspect. But that's more specifically what I mean when I'm using those terms.
So I imagine that the person you were talking to, who said your work is very American, was probably not an American, right?
No.
Right. And so I'm curious about your response to that. Not necessarily your response to them, but what you said just now about like that some people might be offended by that. And the reason I bring this up is that I often think about how the terminology around like like even being called American and sort of even it's a matter of fact, right? You were born in America, you're an American. So this is not up for debate. But the response or reaction that someone might have to being called that categorically, um, is something that's interesting to me because I do believe that as far as the visual arts are concerned, and I can say this, for myself as being a curator, I do understand that my perspective is very American.
Mm.
And Because I no longer, and this becomes even more pronounced given that I no longer live in America. So then I really become very, very hyper aware of how American my sensibilities are. But for you as an artist, um, where does America sit in your work?
Mm. Whew. I think everything for me is like a response to American politics, right? It's through like my mom was born in 1963 in Alabama. So, that's a really specific experience, right? Experiencing the tail end of segregation, having to go to schools when they're just being integrated, kind of understanding your relationship to a place through opposition, through civil rights, I think is so specific. And I grew up with the effects of that, right? That trauma that she carried transfers on to me. And when I think about like everything I do, there are some artists who are going to make work about, something that's happening somewhere else because their general politics or their general ethics are concerned with global highlighting of certain issues. I think for me, when I am looking at the world, like frankly, I think I have to focus, or not even have to focus. I think like what just resonates with me and where I also see these things blowing up, it's always here in America, here in the States. I think we do have an issue, for example, with gun violence. I've made a lot of pieces in my career in response to Black trauma and Black death at the hands of like police brutality. And that is a problem that we see here in America, right? We're not seeing that happening as much, as frequently, as often as we do here. It's not a like ongoing, constant trauma. And so when I'm thinking about how people talk to me and I'm thinking about how I move throughout the world, I'm thinking about, and especially now that I've been able to travel, it comes true where I'm like American racism or an American experience of Blackness is very unique and very specific. And so my understandings also of just like how the world works is just like shaped in that because that's where I was raised. When I go to like the UK also and like having conversations, the country that your family is from is so much more important than it is in the United States. My mom is Jamaican. That's not a conversation that I have very often here in the US. But it's a conversation that matters a lot more when I'm in London and people are like asking me about heritage. And I think that also then stems back to like colonization and slavery, etc. But everything, I think when you are American, everything you do just becomes about that. And when we also think about, and when I think about social media and I think about, you know, viral memes or viral reactions or media or pop culture, a lot of the things that we see driving forth are from American influencers. And so I'm really focused and really like deep into American like lore, so to speak.
Thank you, thank you. So we have some images of some of your work, and we're going to get the first image up because I have some questions about your work that might be best asked with a visual to
Yeah.
support it. So you mentioned, kind of growing up with technology always being prevalent in your life, and more specifically the internet. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the internet and by extension social media and
Mhm.
how that sort of brought you to this sort of current, I would say, current body of work. Although I'm sure you've been sort of steeped in this for years. Talk a little bit about your relationship to the internet and social media as it relates to the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I think Well, so I will say social media really spurred my practice. Like, really, really is what I think gave a reason of life for the work I was making. And it was just because of this very specific relationship that we all have to our phones and to people that we follow and interact with on social media, which is this cult like kind of relationship, this kind of like false worship, this idea of like influencers, notoriety, infamy. It's really interesting. And I think for me, the first ever tapestry I made said, God is a young hot ebony and she's on the internet. And it was very controversial for a lot of reasons. But for me, when I was making that piece, I was really just thinking about the fact that, I've been pedestaled as somebody who is just, at this point in time, I'm a very average person. I'm really at this point just a Black woman with opinions on the internet as literally anyone else can be. But I've somehow have found myself receiving praise from some people and a lot of hate from others simply for having an opinion on how my existence should function in society. And so, again, as I was saying earlier, like we can't do anything without our phones. I found myself in a position of gaining a lot of followers for having these opinions. And for being vocal. And so the work kind of was born out of this grappling with this feeling of being appreciated in certain contexts. And one of the things that was really important when making this specific body of work for the exhibition was thinking about that relationship and kind of thinking about the impact that it has had on me and how I make work and how I am able to create or what I think I'm able to offer to the world. I have, 4 Instagrams, 2 Twitters, 2 Facebooks, a TikTok, the list goes on and on. And we're at the point right now in creation where you post something online for validation before you do anything else with it, right? Your metrics, your algorithms, all of those things just really impact your ability to feel successful and your self-esteem. So when we think about the impact of the internet, it's there. And so when I'm making work and I'm thinking about, so I think about that side of work, but I also think about what does it mean to literally just be a person trying to exist. And not in this piece in particular, but when I'm thinking about memes, I'm thinking about Black people taken out of context, right? Because of a moment paused and posted on the internet. So when we think about ontology and we think about self-representation, we have to think about how the internet provides a space to reclaim access to the body, access to the self, to celebrate the self, but also creates another vehicle for violence. And so this work in particular, Come Outside, We Finna Jump You, is really a surveillance piece. It's really a piece about kind of, using the camera as a face, considering your geolocation, considering, eye emojis, just considering all of these different tools of watching and subverting the gaze that is rampant on the internet, especially when we're talking about consumption.
And there's obviously sort of like a sort of pronounced sexuality in the work, and obviously when we talk about Black bodies, particularly Black women's bodies and the internet, that is something that kind of like comes up. How have you sort of grappled with that as it relates to the work that you make? I also know that you are, in some ways, sort of sending up some of the stereotypes that we see online, but also incorporating them into your work. How do you strike that balance between maybe satire or appropriation? I mean, I'm sure you think through all of these things when you're making the work, but I'm just kind of curious to kind of hear a little bit more about your thought process around the imagery that you use.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think in terms of like sexuality, especially in the work, I think for the longest time, I was really confused why people always ask me questions about sexuality when making the work.
Yeah,
Because for a long time, there wasn't any evidence of that outside of my body.
right.
And so that taught me, right, about how even in this far removed context, the work was still somehow erotic or provocative. And that the black body, the black woman's body in particular, sparks that conversation. And I had an issue with that. Especially I think because as like a lot of black, girls grow up and have to become women, we are constantly shamed about our bodies. I cannot remember specifically which what the quote was, but I was reading Bone Black recently, and just an entire chapter was on female sexuality and masturbation, right? And that coming of age and having to hide kind of that relationship. And so I think I grew up, especially with this idea and this mindset being kind of told to me and shown to me by society of like, you do not want to have anyone ever look at you a certain way, or you do not want to be perceived this way. And yeah, you do everything, in your power to kind of have this straight-laced, very perfect, angelic relationship to the world or perception, and then you can just show up one day and take a photo and have that all be taken away from you anyway. And again, especially with the internet, again, I was doxxed in 2016, 2017, and I had images of me that weren't inherently sexual spread around the internet. And by the time those images were done being spread, they went from kind of just being innocent photos I took in photo booth on my laptop for a project to kind of racy and salacious images that I really needed taken off the internet. And so the context really changes things. When I'm adding in um, screenshots from Pornhub, for me, it's really about kind of erasing that shame within the self. I'm making the connection on one hand for the viewer because it's going to be made anyway. Um, Kind of reclaiming language around sexuality, using terms like young hot ebony, right? Referencing the ebony porn category in porn sites is all about erasing shame. And again, kind of getting a leg up on the viewer. A lot of people, I think, underestimate or maybe don't pay attention to, I think, like what an artist kind of wants sometimes, or what an artist is really doing. And I think sometimes for me, I have just been like, I am so often without control of myself when I think about, if I walk outside right now, I have no control over anything. And so when I am in my work and I'm crafting the work, it is such a controlled environment. And so if I know that someone is going to have, which I learned, right, is that someone's going to have this conversation about sexuality because I'm wearing red, or just because my body looks a certain way, or just because I'm a confident woman taking a selfie, I might as well kind of go there and make the viewer uncomfortable. Or I might as well
No,
go there and spark a conversation.
yeah, yeah, I understand fully. I understand fully. Let's get to the next image. I have more follow-up questions, along
Mhm.
what you just said, and then some new things as well. So, first, and I didn't do this on the first image, and I should have, but we have a few more images, so I will do it now. And that is give you a moment to explain a bit about what we're seeing. So we have the title, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about this work.
I don't know. I kind of like the questions. instead of just the, well, here's what I see. Because I think the work always benefits. And I think, especially for me, as somebody who, I make works like, someone might make a Facebook status. I'm constantly trying to provoke a reaction. And I say that especially as somebody who used to be very active on Facebook. But, I think for me, I much prefer the dialogue. I much prefer to leave things open. I much prefer to, kind of let conclusions be drawn and kind of force people to, I think, react. I think everything for me is about like forcing a reaction. But with Ebony online, that was a piece I made for the end of, I was in a residency at the Studio Museum in Harlem a few years ago, and I came out with this piece as kind of my culmination of my time there. And really, I think it's kind of for me interesting because it was really just about kind of a marking of time on my body than it was about anything else. And so we can have a lot of conversations, I think, about latex and material and like posing. And I think all of those things were, true. But I was really just kind of looking at the fact that I had changed, right? I came into this career in 2019. I started, showing work. And then here I was in 2022 and I was older, and I think that's the thing that is also interesting about making work, and why I really also wanted this piece in the show is that, especially when I'm the subject of my work, I change day to day, year to year. And it's really interesting to consider the work as an archive of the self. Unintentionally, I think, well, unbeknownst to me at the time, and then I think just the further I got out, I was just like, okay, that's really interesting. And it's really interesting to think about how my body's changed, how my concerns with my body have changed, how I show my body, how I pose my body. But really then I had realized that, yeah, I had gained weight and I had gotten older. And my biggest concern at that time was, how does that fit into desirability politics? Is this still consumable, right? How does the audience's relationship to me change when I change? I know that my relationship to myself has changed. I know that is already, its own turmoil. But what happens when your internalized issues become externalized? So I had so many concerns around, well, should I use older images? Should I not take newer images? I think, there are so many different choices that I get to make, and making this piece, Ebony Online, was really just about that, kind of being shameless and kind of going forward with choosing honesty within my work and choosing to take care of my body, honestly, to take care of myself. When I say take care, I don't mean just like eat right, sleep right, and all those things, but I mean like actually care and support myself. And so that was one part. And the other part of it, which is something that I really don't talk about, was when I do think about my body, I do have to consider my health. And my health during this time was not really great. And I use the Sacred Heart a lot in my works. Obviously, it's a very easy religious symbol to kind of use and to replicate, and to think about like your hand over your heart. But I actually did have a bit of like a health issue at the beginning of my time in the residency, where I ended up in the hospital, and I found out that I had an alarmingly high heart rate. And it was just because I was burning myself out and drinking a extreme amount of caffeine. And it's just things like that you just don't speak to anybody about and you don't talk about. And so I'm thinking about this like anatomical heart. I'm thinking about, this devotion. I was looking at a lot of Greek sculpture for women's bodies, and kind of thinking about times where I've seen perhaps a plus size body actually, relaxed and, poised in art. And so those were kind of all the things I was thinking of when I was putting that together.
So, so many things to follow up on. Let's get the next image
Yeah.
up, and here's the next question I want to ask you. So, you
Hmm.
mentioned that you have multiple avatars currently or throughout your history of interacting with social media or what have you. When you use images of yourself in your work, are you portraying yourself or are you portraying a version of yourself?
Both. I
Okay.
think the answer, yeah, it's definitely both. And it's both because I think, you know, like I said, I have all these different social media accounts at present, right? Throughout my life, the numbers have changed. But I think social media is a performance, most of your friends on social media are showing you, right, their best side or, the life they want to live. And I think I do that same thing too. Like we're all participants of that. But I also think, I have, that burner account on Twitter where I get to be myself, right? I get to be this different version of myself. And so I think that on social media or in different avatars, we are all playing a different version of ourselves, and I think, they're all just split across different places. And I think in the work, as I'm like tackling different issues, there are different parts of me that come out in that. Um, there are different ways that I step into myself that I can access a certain thing. But it's not right. It's performance, but it's not fabricated. If that makes sense.
No, that makes complete sense. And I think what I'd like to do, since I'm like looking at the time now, I could talk to you all day, and I realize like we're coming down to about what is probably the final 15 minutes. So let's go to the next image. I have a couple of follow-on questions, and we also have an opportunity to get a little sneak peek into your studio, which we're going to fit into today's interview for sure. So this work here is a bit different from what we've seen previously. It's much more text heavy. And because I cannot read the text at this scale, maybe in this case, you could tell us a bit more about this particular work.
Yeah, I'm happy to say more, but it's really funny because that piece was really directly inspired by the former title of my solo show in London last year, which was TLDR, which stands for Too Long Didn't Read. And I really, for this piece, I really had, I just traveled. I was really seeing all these amazingly large woven pieces that kind of just behaved to me more sculpturally just because of their scale. But they didn't really, for me, kind of do anything necessarily with that scale other than just kind of being a beautiful large thing. I didn't feel like perhaps that content needed to be that large. And so for me, I kind of was just thinking about, well, if I were to do it, the same way, and I've made large format pieces before, I kind of was like, well, what did I want to see? And every time you download anything onto your computer, you have to read terms of agreement. And so I really became interested in terms of agreement policies, not actually through ever reading one, but just through considering what would happen if we accidentally signed something away that we cared about. Um, and so I just really just became interested in like the language and the potential and also the waste of time that it is. When I think about time a lot, and oftentimes I'm trying to maximize my time, but sometimes I consider, well, what does it mean to kind of waste time getting lost into something and kind of feeling trapped into something else? So this piece, I Still Need That 40 Acres, is actually terms of agreement for accessing Blackness reimagined as a digital website um, that you have to read. You have to get to the bottom of the terms of agreement to sign in order to access the website, but you can't. And so for me, I wanted to create something that was essentially inaccessible. And that was that was really it. I just wanted to make something that was so inaccessible, because I have, another piece, and I think we'll talk about it probably in a second, linguistics, but they kind of serve hand in hand, right? One piece is kind of offering up some insight into Blackness as an experience, especially catered and curated through the internet. And the other piece is kind of saying, well, you can't actually get in here. And if you want to get in here, you kind of need to read this thing. But as you're reading, this kind of collapsing scroll, you start to realize it doesn't really make any sense. And some of the terms are repeated, or just also examining the language of these things. This was the first time I ever even attempted to read, this legal contract. And so really for me, it was more so about, right, an endurance piece. Again, I always say I'm trying to provoke the viewer. It's an endurance piece for the viewer. Can the viewer discern anything? Can they make it to the end? Do they walk away? Do they stay longer? What does that relationship kind of look like when challenged with a different type of piece?
Fantastic. You mentioned a work that this is sort of connected to. Let's get to that work now. Is this the piece you were referring to?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really, in considering things I do and I don't do in my work, one of the things that I have always had a passion for is, memes on the internet, but not just memes, but specifically how Blackness has impacted, and Black people have impacted almost every major social media platform, to the point where there is Black Twitter, there is Black Facebook, there's Black TikTok. Like, your algorithms know your race. If you go on Google right now and you look at your analytics, there is a spot where you can see all of the things that Google thinks that you are, like your age range, your race, your gender, like just where you're from. It's just all there, whether you're signed into, actually you do have to be signed into your account, I think, but it tracks all that data. And so I was really just interested in memes specifically, and how they go from point A to point B when we're considering viral moments. And then I also wanted to know more so the history behind those moments. And what I found a lot of the times is that we take memes so far out of context that we often miss real significant life events. There was this one reaction video in particular, and I say reaction video because that's what it became. But there was a woman on Big Brother who was wearing a bonnet and smoking a cigarette, a Black woman. And she was calling someone out on the TV show for saying the N-word. And this person was like a white individual, and they were like arguing about it. But the only thing that the internet took away from that video was the fact that she was pointing with a cigarette in her hand and wearing a bonnet, and that she looked angry. And so immediately that became a reaction meme, a reaction video, and then it became a reaction meme, and then it circulated throughout social media. And so I think a lot about these kind of vehicles for liberation, for fun, for joy, for escapism, and then also these vehicles for extended violence. And when placing memes in the work and thinking about, right, who accesses memes, I also am just thinking about, well, what do I relate to in that? And so I just took a bunch of these images from my phone, from my own personal archive that I've had throughout the years, and I just tried to kind of randomly select memes that I felt were of cultural significance for the last decade, within my understanding of the Black experience and in internet. And I titled it Linguistics because I really, especially when we're talking about like African American vernacular English, or AVE, I really think that, right, the ability to laugh or have humor or to share grief is just as big of a part of that. But I was thinking about the last piece as the conditions of viewing, or something that kind of engages the viewer through viewing, versus just kind of like being like, well, here's a bunch of memes, and like, here you go about your day.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to try to get to seeing your space, and I know that we're getting tight on time. I love listening to your answers to these questions. They're so thorough. So you're a dream interview because
Thank
I
you.
can ask a question and I can just like listen and listen. So let's do this. Let's switch gears. We may have one more image, if I'm not mistaken. But what I'd love to do instead, let's go ahead and see if we can switch cameras and kind of get a
Yeah,
little bit of a walkthrough of your space.
yeah, let's do that. And I think we are ready. Although, maybe not. I did have the, I'm like, technology. I'm like, I just sung technology's praises for the last hour. But I am ready, so I am going to turn this on.
Yeah, let's give it a shot.
Okay. All right. Not sure if we're there yet, but I think we will be in 1 second. Or maybe not.
And if we're unable to, I have more questions, so no worries.
Yeah, I'm like, it's there. I don't know if we'll be able to connect. I guess we'll see it if it does turn on, but at the moment I don't see it.
That's fine. That's fine. I mean, if it doesn't, it doesn't. So, so I have a couple more questions, and they're kind of common questions, but they're still worth asking. So you mentioned early on, you mentioned Faith Ringgold. So
Mhm.
so I'm also as someone who had some influence on you. I'm also curious about other influences. I mean, we talked a lot about technology and the internet, but who are some of the and your family? But who are some of the other sort of artistic influences that have kind of like helped you think about yourself as a creative individual, as an artist?
Yeah, I think I have always been more drawn to music instead of the traditional fine arts. And so a lot of the influences for me, and especially music, plays a very direct role in my practice. I have a lot of pieces named after titles and songs, or I have a playlist for almost every single show I've ever done, and for half the works I make. I would say, I hate to bring up Kanye, but Kanye West was a really big influence of mine, especially a couple years ago. I made a piece called The Black Madonna Whore Complex that was inspired by Kanye West and Sigmund Freud. And for me, that came together because I was just making this work. I had a really tight deadline, and I was listening to music, and Bound to by Kanye came on. And so I was just listening to the song. As a song, it's incredible. But I was listening to this song, and I'm like still thinking about Kim Kardashian and Kanye West and their relationship and Amber Rose, and like, so in the background, I'm like thinking about all this pop culture drama, and I'm just making the work. And so I kind of sometimes I get stuck on lyrics, and for me, lyrics kind of become this thing I have to expand. So Kanye in that song says, "One good girl is worth 1,000." And so I was like, well, what does that mean, and what does that look like what does that performance look like? And so when I'm in my Photoshop, I'm collaging, and I'm just putting the phrase over and over again, and I'm like, no, that just doesn't really feel right to me. And then I get on Twitter just for a quick break, and I see this thread that one of my friends retweeted that was about the Madonna whore complex. And it was specifically a Black woman talking about her dating experiences with Black men who use Black women, kind of to fulfill these certain roles, or are really obsessed with maybe perhaps the video vixen archetype, and then in reality leave their Black women, to date different women. And I hadn't heard of that before. And even so, I had kind of heard of the Madonna horror complex because I am a kind of a big Freud stan, but I hadn't really considered, right, the real life, present day, relationship to this. And I then started to consider myself. And when I'm making these works, I like always have to consider like myself, like as a person. And then I have to consider like myself as a thing on the wall that the audience is going to interact with. So I'm like, wow, like, thinking about like my own personality. So music really plays a good influence on me. I'm a really huge fan of Petra Courtwright. She is an incredible artist. I don't want to say like she's, just digital, because she has a lot of different works that she makes, but her, relationship to the internet, her early videos and manipulation of the body and kind of experiencing of the body through performance on the internet has always been really inspiring to me. I hate to also not hate to also I hate to say that Marcel Duchamp is a very big influence on me, and the Dada movement and kind of this found object movement has been really important to my practice. But I remember learning about him when I was a freshman in college, and I remember I was like, that is so lazy. I was like, this is so lazy. And I was like, only, this like man, this white man in this certain time period can come in and like write his name on this thing. And eventually, we find out like it's stolen, like whatever. But I was just kind of like, this is the laziest thing. And that same professor that introduced me to Marcel Duchamp also introduced me to Sol LeWitt and, instruction-based art, and had us making projects in that vein. And that really actually changed my entire brain process around making art. Because I did have a lot of biases, I felt at the time, about like what good art was and what made good art. And, I was also still kind of into drawing at this time. So I'm like, you got to be perfect. You got to be technically perfect. You have to have your own style. It's all these things. But sometimes it's just about noticing, and sometimes it's just about the idea. And I think for me, working in familiar objects always, right? I'm working in jacquard because it's always been there, and because I had a moment with a familiar object. I had a moment with jacquard object, and then working in tufting. My parents. There's like photos of my baby room, and there are like Looney Tune rugs nailed into the wall. And so I'm always like, I hated that. That was so lazy, and I'm lucky that I get to make and work with these materials and the fabricators who make some of these objects. But that really, really did change my entire relationship to art.
So I think that is the perfect place for us to end our conversation, because I have like 10 more questions, but it is already it's at the time where we have to
Time
end. So
flew.
I want to thank you so much for your responses, your thoroughness, your thoughtfulness, your generosity. I know that these things are not always very easy, because it's labor intensive. It's work to answer all of these questions. So I want to thank you for putting all of that work in. Looking forward to seeing your exhibition at the Harvey B. Gantt Center. And again, thank you. I have some final words that I have to read at the end of this, but I didn't want it to just be like an abrupt ending. So I just wanted to let you know that we all
Thank
really, really
you.
appreciate your time. So thank you
Thank
so much. And it was fun. And all my other questions, I'm going to ask you those questions offline. So you'll be
you.
hearing from me. So final words. The Gantt Center's goal is always to provide programs that inform and inspire. The support of viewers like you allows the Gantt to expand its reach and further develop programs like today's Open Air. You can lend your support to the Gantt Center by texting Give to Gantt, GIVE, the number 2, Gantt, to 91999. Also, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel for future programs and other video updates. We want to thank you for joining us for this great conversation. And also, we look forward to seeing you at next month's open air with Christopher Myers. That's on June 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Have a great evening, and thank you again. Good night.